is that there is a view panel at the very top of your screen, and you can either have one person on screen at a time, or you can see everybody. And I do recommend that you have the area, that the speaker view they call it, where you can see one person at a time, because that way you don't get distracted by everybody else. The other thing is you're all on mute. And there is an area that you can type, and those messages will come directly to me. I'm going to do my bookseller job and put a link to the book of the moment in that typing area, so you can see where that is. And so that's a link to the book, All Our Relations, and you can go directly to that from that link. But also for 24 hours from the end of this event, there's a discount code for people who've attended the event. So if you go on our online shop, you can put discount code EVENT, and that will give you 10% off your whole purchase. That's not just All Our Relations, but all of the books that you purchase at the same time will get a 10% discount. So just letting you know about that. And I think that's all. Is that all I need to? Yes, I think that's all I need to tell you about. So I'm going to now introduce, as I admit more people, I'm going to start the event from now. So welcome everybody. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on in this area. It's the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here today. I'd also like to acknowledge that in this strange Zoom world, we are zooming out onto the lands of many different language groups, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders that you of the lands on which you're watching from as well, and to acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, always was and always will be, and that sovereignty was never ceded, and that we're very lucky to be continuing to tell stories on land that has been storytelling land for a very, very, very long time. So I'd like to welcome our guests today. So we have the wonderful Tanya Talaga, who is the acclaimed author of Seven Fallen Feathers, a multi-award winner, including the RBC Taylor Prize, the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing, and the First Nations Community Read Award. The book was a finalist in the Hilary Weston's Writers Trust Non-Fiction Prize and the BC National Award for Non-Fiction. Talaga was the 2018 CBC Massey Lecturer and is the author of the US bestseller All Our Relations, which we're talking about today. For more than 20 years, she's been a journalist at the Toronto Star, and she's of Polish and Ojibwe descent, and her grandmother is a member of Fort William First Nation. And so we're crossing the world now to chat to her. And here in Australia, we have the wonderful Ellen van Neerven, who will be in conversation. And Ellen is an award-winning writer of Manajali Yungambay and Dutch heritage. They write fiction, poetry, plays, and non-fiction. Ellen's first book, Heat and Light, was the recipient of the David Uniapan Award and the Dobby Literary Award and the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards Indigenous Writers Prize. Ellen's second book, a collection of poetry, Comfort Food, was shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award, the Kenneth Slessor Prize, and highly commended in the 2016 Wesley Michael Wright Prize. And earlier this year, we launched Throat, Ellen's second poetry collection, which is an absolutely wonderful piece of work. You must all put that in your carts with that 10% discount because it's really great. It's a poetry collection, and I'm sure it's going to go on to sweep the awards as it rolls out over the next year or two. So everybody, I'm just going to hand over to Ellen, and you can take over from here, Ellen.
Jingari Jimbalung. Thank you, Chrissy. I'm going to do my own acknowledgement of country. I must say that I'm very excited to be talking to our sister from far away today in this digital place. Must acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land and sovereignty was never ceded. I'm talking to you today from Turrbal country where I live, just north of Yagara country where the bookshop is located, Turrbal and Yagara being the communities of Meanjin, Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future, for allowing us to live and write on this country. And I'd also like to acknowledge my own ancestors. I'm a Yagara Yugambeh person, so my people are from the lands just south of Yagara. We come from black soil country between the Logan and Albert rivers. Totem is Mibin, the wedge-tailed eagle, who flies over our country and keeps us safe. Both my mother's mother and my mother's father were Mulunjali people, and part of this big family in Southeast Queensland, the Curry and Williams families. So I'd like to acknowledge all of my elders and relations that live here and work here and contribute to who I am as a person. I'd like to also acknowledge any First Nations peoples that are watching today live or on replay, and acknowledge your ancestors as well. I am very excited to be in conversation with you. Hello, Tanya. It's been a long time coming, because this was meant to be a in-person event, but I'm really glad that we can talk in this way. I just wanted to give us a short introduction to how I began reading your work. So I'm going to kind of track back a little bit and say I've been to Canada twice for work, and the first time was in Toronto, and I actually met two people that you mentioned in this book, two senior writers, leaders. Got to sit down with them, Arnie Lee Maracle and Uncle Thomas King, that they seem to have really influenced your work. Yeah, totally. So it was beautiful. It was just such a privilege to meet them and sit down with them and to also read their work. The second time I was in Canada in 2017, somebody said to me, you have to read this book. They gave me 7 Fallen Feathers. I sat down in my hotel room and started reading it. It was a heartbreaking read, and I felt like I had to keep putting it down. But there was 3 things that were in my head. One was that this book is so well written. 2, this is a story that needs to be told in this form. And 3, I'm so glad a First Nations person has written this book, because it carries this sensitivity and nuance. And I could really feel that the stories in this book and the community was being honored. So I've been following your writing ever since then, and I could not recommend your 2 books any highly. They're essential reading if you want to understand trauma in an Indigenous context. They're difficult reads, but very important reads. And so I'm really excited to hear you talk about this work. So could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe a little introduction?
Buzu anin wachea Tanya Talaga Nigisnikas Kamusko Pimojijet Pineshish Nigisnikas. Hi everyone, I'm excited to talk to you, and I'm very, very sorry that I didn't get a chance to actually come to Brisbane. I was so looking forward to seeing Australia finally. And I had this big elaborate sort of trip planned, or it was elaborate for me because I'd be crossing an ocean, which would be huge. And I'm sorry that at this time we cannot do that. I am speaking to you today from Toronto, Takaranto. This is a traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and it is the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee people. I'm talking to you from my home, and I live with my 2 children in the east part of Toronto. And I actually write about it in a little bit in All Our Relations. I live quite close to something called Kashigo Road, which is this tiny little squiggle of a road, like a laneway, that was named after a family, First Nations family, that lived here about 7,000 years ago. And sadly, though, it's the only remembrance to the family or to any Indigenous presence in this part of the city. So that's a thing, but that's a thing in many, many colonized nations. And I'm really grateful that you have invited me to talk about the book here today. I don't know if you wanted me to talk about how I got into writing the book, or if you're going to ask me questions, but I speak sometimes in circles, and I often give lengthy answers, so I apologize for that. But I'm a storyteller, so that's what happens.
I was going to say, it's a very Indigenous way of answering questions, and I've anticipated that. So please circle away and don't feel like you need to shorten your answers. So
Good.
yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about this book and how the process of writing and how it came to be?
This book came to be in a really kind of different way, an odd way. When I finished Seven Fallen Feathers, which is, just so you know, it's a book about 7 First Nations, so 7 Indigenous high school students who died in the waters surrounding Thunder Bay from 2000 to 2011. I should say that 5 of the students died in the water, and 2 of them died in their boarding homes. And their deaths are all mysteries. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the children were in Thunder Bay. And Thunder Bay is a city of about 120,000 people. It's a little city, and it's on the edge of the largest freshwater lake in the world, Gitchigami, or Lake Superior. And it's about 2,000 kilometers away from Toronto, north of Toronto, if that helps you at all with your geography or your distance. Toronto is in the very southern part of Canada. Thunder Bay is quite north. And I just got finished writing that book, 7 Fallen Feathers, and it had taken a lot out of me. I've been a journalist for quite a long time, about 25 years. I was at the Toronto Star for about 22 years, 23 years. The Toronto Star is the largest newspaper, city newspaper in Canada. And I was, I was tired. I'd finished 7 Fallen Feathers. I was emotionally tired. I was mentally tired. It was an investigative work. It was pretty exhausting. And it was hard to write too, because I was writing about people from my community, my communities. And just as the book was about finishing, I was told, you should really apply for the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy. And I'm like, I don't think I can fill out an application form. And this was like, the mother of all application forms. Is like 2,000 words. You had to give an essay and all this stuff with it. I'm like, I just do not have the bandwidth. I can't do anything like that right now. But everyone said, you really should apply for this. And what the Atkinson Fellowship is you get a year off from your job if you're a full-time journalist somewhere. and you can write whatever you want as long as you write something that has to do with public policy change. So pick one subject, write 8 feature stories, get a whole year off. You get to, you get money for travel. So it's almost like a little bit of a sabbatical for a writer. And it was during that time, and I had picked for my topic of public policy change, I picked suicide and why it is young youth in our communities were taking their lives at such incredible numbers. I had some inclination as to why. I thought that colonization, trauma, residential schools, poverty, addictions, like so many things played into, why this was. But I said, I'm just going to go, I'm going to look at it anyway. So I did. I started to research into why this is happening. And during that time, I was approached by my publisher and by CBC, which is like ABC in Australia. It's a national Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It's a national broadcaster, and they asked me to be the Massey lecturer. And I don't know if you've heard, Ellen, if you've listened to the lectures. They've been broadcast, I think, on Spotlight in Australia.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about those of
yeah,
us
it's
that
sort of all
haven't?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is one of my circles. So so they asked me, will you be a Massey lecturer? And just for background for everyone, the Massey lectures are named after a former Governor General Vincent Massey in Canada. And the Massey lectures have been, they're given to one public intellectual every single year. You get to write a book, deliver 5 lectures across Canada, and those lectures are broadcast on CBC, BBC, and usually ABC radio. And so when I was asked to be the Massey lecturer, I thought, oh my God, they must have mixed up with someone else. How could they possibly be asking me to do this? They're like, no, we really want you to do it. After reading 7 Fallen Feathers, we want you to do this. And then I said, well, it's such an honor. When can I, I'm really looking forward to this in 2019. And they're like, no, we want you to write it now. So I had 5 months essentially to write this book.
5 months. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So this is a long answer. See what I mean about like circle? But
it's tough. Yeah.
Most of it was already up here, right? Like, most of what was going on was already up there. I knew what directions I wanted to go in. This book is very much about healthcare systems in Canada. It's about genocide in Canada and in Australia and in America and in Brazil and in the Sami lands. So there was a definite thread. And I basically had no life for 5 months. It was like round the clock working. And I traveled to northern Norway to visit the Sami people. And as well, I was in communities all through Canada. Coast Salish, West Coast in Vancouver. In our north, my communities, and Sweden. It was a lot, but it got. I'm glad for it. I'm glad for it very much. So I hope the book opens eyes and people see the what happens when Indigenous lands are colonized and what's left in its wake. And that is essentially been the destructions of our people. So,
yeah, I think it's a very easy for us to understand the the damage to land, to country, as we say in an Aboriginal Australian context, equals damage to our own health, like health of country and health of peoples being so intrinsically linked, that it's frustrating that we have to continue to explain to governments, to other people, that this is you know, this is all linked, and we need to. I'm really interested in your book. You call to Indigenous solutions to these problems. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, you know, there's a senator here that I speak to often. His name is Murray Sinclair, and Senator Murray Sinclair, he is Ojibwe, so he's Anishinaabe. He's like myself, and he was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And TRC, just for your knowledge, if you don't know, and you know, you probably don't if you haven't read one of my books, but the TRC was similar to the commission that looked into sexual abuse in Australia, that lasted about 6 years. That Helen was she was one of the commissioners for the commission. Murray in Canada was a commission for the TRC, but the TRC specifically looked at the 139 Indian residential schools that were set up across Canada from the mid 1800s to 1996 is when the last school closed. And those schools took First Nations children, you know, and, you know, beat the Indian out of the child, took away their language, their culture, their clothes, everything, identities, to make them good British subjects. And Murray, he was the chair of, you know, he listened to 6,000 survivors talk about this and came up with this, you know, massive report. He told me that Indigenous people need to do things for themselves. You know, we have to rely on the teachings and the practices that have sustained us for thousands and thousands of years. And I very much looked at that during this book because I was looking at Western science. You know, I was talking to doctors, I was reading medical studies, I was talking to nurses, you know, going to psychiatric institutions, talking to everybody about where are the best practices when it comes to youth suicide. What, you know, and I was reading everything I could to try and find answers. But the more I read, the more I instinctively knew that we would not be finding answers in these medical journals. We had to look inward and look to ourselves and who we are as Indigenous people to try and find a way forward. You know, Murray asks questions that he said, you know, all Indigenous people ask the same questions in their lives to make them stronger. You know, who am I? Where do I come from? What is my purpose? Where do I belong? Those 4 questions, every single Indigenous person should be asking themselves those questions. And I would argue probably every person should be asking themselves those questions to get a sense of self, and a sense of pride. You know, you asked about what those solutions are. There are no easy solutions. Every community has different solutions, has different teachings, right? And you have to rely on those teachings and the land and culture and language in order to strengthen yourself, in order to move forward. But that's really hard to do when you're living in a country that's been colonized, that imposes rules, racist laws, where children are born in circumstances beyond their control, right? When children are born into poverty, into places with no running water, no chances for education, and our children are products of our history. Yes. And they didn't ask to be born there in this place and space, but this is where they are. So how do you get them stronger? How do we lead them forward? And I think those 4 questions help a lot.
I love those 4 questions. You write in your book that Indigenous youth suicide is not just a Canadian problem. Across the globe, Indigenous people in colonized countries share a crushing commonality. Their children are dying by their own hands. Something that's, you know, I don't know an Indigenous person that has not been affected by a suicide. And the statistics back me up on that, where the statistic I read today, 95% of Aboriginal people in Australia are affected by a suicide. 6 times greater likelihood that Aboriginal people commit suicide compared to non-Aboriginal people. And I wanted to quote a Noongar elder, Uncle Robert Eggington, who says that suicide was unknown to Aboriginal people traditionally. So there's undeniable link between colonisation and the structures that you talk about, the lack of proper health care, the incarceration of our people. You mentioned Mr. Dungay Jr. In one of your chapters, you allude to his death. He, I think everyone in Australia will know this story because it's become quite topical with the Black Lives Matters, Indigenous Lives Matters movements around the world. Mr. Dungay's last words were, "I can't breathe." He mentioned those words 12 times, just like Mr. Floyd in America. This was maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, and when the family of Mr. Dungay Jr. Wanted to protest and to gather some media attention about his death in custody by white policemen piled on top of him, being murdered in police custody. Only 30 people at that time attended the protests, and it got very little media coverage.
Wow.
So when I read that in your book, it's in this chapter that's called "I Breathe for Them." Your book being in 5 chapters. You constantly are doing these comparisons with other countries, looking outside of Canada, looking outside of your own community. And I know that you also traveled to Norway, sat down with the Sami people. Why is it important for you to make these comparisons and to talk about this in a global context?
Which, I've been thinking a lot about Mr. Dungay since George Floyd happened, and about I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And I remember him saying, that 12 times. And I remember reading that, and that's a phrase that's been uttered so many times. If you're Black or Indigenous and you're, it's awful. It's awful. And I think that there's strength in unity. I think that there's more that binds us together than separates us as Indigenous people. I think, we have a commonality of experience in the residential schools, in how we've been treated, in racism, and how that has been the overarching effect of all of our lives and of our families' lives. My mother's life, my mother's family's lives, my sister, my mother's brothers. Like, it's undeniable. And it's the same story. It's the same story in my family that's quite similar probably to your story, and to other First Nations people in Australia, in Sami lands. Like, every place that I would go and speak to people, it was like, it's the same story, and I noticed that too from just being here and being an Ojibwe woman. Like, and every time I would meet a family, I would hear a story that reminded me of my story, or and I was always struck by that. And to hear it played out time and time again in colonized nations is remarkable to me. I mean, the similarities, getting back to the suicide rates in youth, in young men especially. All of our communities have that in common. You know, we also have poverty in common. We have a lack of getting into the job market and the economy. High school education, if you graduate from high school, that's a big deal, and a lot of our people haven't and gone on to post-secondary. There's so many things that when you start scratching the surface, you see there's so many common themes.
And these are all truths, you know, these are all truths that define us and define our lives. But how do you resist that deficit narrative that's so often we're so often framed in these ways and almost trapped in these narratives of deficit?
Mm-hmm. Because of hope and resiliency, you know, I always think that the actual fact that we're still here, we're not erased, and our youth are learning language again, learning traditions again, keeping culture alive, keeping our history alive. That gives me incredible faith that we'll still be here. And so that's sort of the undercurrent, I hope, in my writing. That
Absolutely.
There's that.
Absolutely. I really feel that. Would you mind? I think you have a little extract that you might want to read for us. Do you feel like you want to read it now?
I would love to get my
reading glasses on.
My reading glasses.
They're nice. I like them.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My gosh, this is what happens after 2 books and 5 decades on this planet. Here we go. This is taken from the second chapter, and it's called Big Brother's Hunger. This is a story that was told to me, and I explain it in the book from the Albany River. Listen, when Edmund Metatawaban gifts you with a story, you had better listen. Ed is standing on his homemade raft, a 16 by 63 foot colossus, slowly making its way down the swollen Albany River, a remote 982 kilometer waterway that begins in northwestern Ontario and feeds into James Bay. The raft, made by Ed's own hands, is just giant cedar logs lying side by side and tied together with generous loops of rope. On top of the raft, taking up about half of its platform, is a small wooden cabin that resembles a motorhome. Inside the cabin, you can hear muffled laughter, dishes clanking, and the sweet smell of warm bannock. That's bread. You don't know. I'm standing beside him in my brown rain suit, covered from head to toe in revolutionary fabric advertised to keep anyone dry in any conditions. But this high-priced suit from the city has become damp under the weight of the water that the clouds are scooping up from the Albany and pelting at us with all their might. The driving rain is pummeling Ed's brown construction jacket. Bits of light from inside the cabin reflect off the orange safety tape on his coat. Ed turns to me and he says, "Big Brother is always hungry. Big Brother has an insatiable appetite, a relentless hunger that rises up from his grumbling belly and makes him a voracious monster. His massive jaws never stop chomping. His mouth moves like a giant sawmill, devouring anything that comes his way. Big Brother is so hungry that he has turned his little brother into a slave, tasked with heading out into the vast wilderness to find him food. So little brother ventures out alone into the northern forests, walking among the scaly-looking red-barked tamarack trees that line the dark waters of the meandering rivers that bleed into the giant bays of the north and to the east. Little brother walks through the black spruce, which have grown tall and lean back from the cold wind blowing along the river's edge. As he goes, little brother chops down everything that he sees. He gathers everything up in large bundles so he can take it all back to Big Brother to feed his hungry belly. Little brother doesn't just gather wood. He also sweeps up all the fish from the black rivers, and he steals the gold and the diamonds from the deep, deep inside the earth's crust. Cruel big brother. He eats and he eats and he eats, Ed says, as water drips off his oilskin fedora. Ed is a community leader to his people, the Cree of James Bay. He is a survivor and the man in charge of what we lovingly call our cruise down the Albany. Ed was one of 150,000 Indigenous Canadians who were separated from their parents and sent to residential school. From the mid-1880s to 1996, there were 139 church-run, government-funded residential schools across Canada, 17 in Ontario. The school's purpose was to convert children to Christianity and isolate them from their homes, families, traditions, and cultures in order to assimilate them to the Canadian way of life. At the age of 7, Ed was taken from his family and sent to the notorious St. Anne's Residential School, run by Oblate Catholic nuns in Fort Albany on the James Bay coast. There, he was physically assaulted regularly and sexually abused by one of the staff. He and his fellow inmates often went to bed hungry, and they lived in fear of the homemade electric chair that used to punish the children. Survivors report students being strapped to the chair and electrocuted until they were semi-conscious. Ed left St. Anne's a broken teenage boy, and when he returned home, he was a stranger to his parents, his siblings, and his Cree culture. He took off heading west, where he drank to forget his painful memories. But somehow, Ed made it back. I'll finish it there.
I'll go in, Tanya. Beautiful reading. I'm reminded now of listening to you talk another interview, and talking about. I want you to explain this a little bit more to our audience about this book being a weave, and maybe also. This title is kind of telling in that, this is a collective story. This is a living story. It's not, that you wrote this book and then, are cut off from the community. This is something that's continuing. Do you want to kind of talk to that a little bit?
I'm just thinking of what's happening now in the communities. Thinking of what's happening in the northwest of Ontario. Since COVID began, the lockdown began on March 12th, we've lost 10 people, 10 community members in northwestern Ontario to suicide. It's still relentless. It still doesn't stop. And I don't think that it will stop until we bring pride back to our people and we bring equity to our people. In Canada, and I know the same is true in Australia, we are still fighting for basic human rights. We are still fighting for something called the social determinants of health. And I talk a lot about them in my book. The right to clean water, the right to safe housing, not moldy housing or rickety housing or housing that's a fire trap, the right to nutritious foods, the right to an education. Like a lot of our kids, like in Seven Fallen Feathers, the children I wrote about that died in Thunder Bay, they were all in Thunder Bay, 600, 700 kilometers away from their home communities and away from their parents, because there are no high schools for them where they live. Imagine sending your 13 or 14-year-olds to go to a city 600 kilometers away for grade 9 in a language they don't speak, English. Often Anishinaabe or Ojibwe Ojibwe is their first language. You don't live with your parents. You've never seen a public transit bus, but you got to get on a bus. You've never seen traffic lights, but you have to negotiate those. I mean, this is a reality of our communities. And when all those schools closed, those residential schools, there was no elaborate system to help them. There was no psychiatrist, no psychologist, no Indigenous healing plan. The survivors were just sent back to their communities where they didn't know anyone anymore. Sometimes they didn't know their language or who they were. Of course there's going to be violence. Of course there's going to be trauma from that time, and you bring that home. Or addiction. I mean, these are all the things that we're left with. And it's going to take generations to fix those issues. And it's going to take equity, and it's going to take power sharing, land sharing, resource sharing. And the dominant power has to be open to that.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned COVID. Unfortunately, I know of a few young people in my community that have passed away by suicide during this COVID period, and I wanted to ask about, you know, this challenge that COVID brings for our communities, where so often our healing is situated in the physical. It's situated by going, you know, engaging with the land, with water, with sitting together. But you know, instead we have these difficulties of not being able to gather and to travel and to be together. What do you see this challenge? Is there any positives in this this COVID situation? I know that potentially it has stopped some development in some places, but also accelerated it in other places.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, in the north, in where I'm from, you know, my mother is from Fort William First Nation, so she was raised in the traditional territory in and around Thunder Bay. So it's pretty. Fort William is slightly urban because, you know, it's there in the city. My mom was raised in the bush though, but north of that in the communities of Anishinaabe Aski Nation territory, which is Treaty Number 9 territory, those are the kids that come down to high school in Thunder Bay, and they are it's also the communities I write about in all our relations, about the girls that took their lives. Very first chapter that I did, they were all from
Pact.
Yeah. But sadly, so this is a long answer to, in almost all of those NAN communities, 49 communities, there are no doctors. No doctors. There are no the clinics there. I mean, they're run by nurses. Some places don't have running water. You know, clean water. You have to truck your water in, or fly it in. I mean, we have basic human rights needs there.
And I'm assuming food shortages as well, like no.
Yeah, the communities have been doing an amazing job. Like Anishinaabe Aski Nation, like they've organized this peer medical group of doctors and public health people. It's this incredible group that is really mobilized and are protecting the communities. And so far, you know, knock wood, so good, you know, so good. Like it's okay. And also the communities have all been locked down, so no one's coming in and out of the communities. And there's like checkpoints at airports and roadways if there are roads. So there's been a real effort made to keep COVID out. And, you know, and I think my friend Wab Rice, he wrote Moon on the Crusted Snow about a post-apocalyptic time, you know, and it's almost like it's now, right? It's like we're returning to land and practices and survival. But Indigenous people have always known how to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this pandemic is not does have a precedent, you know, when we're talking about infectious diseases in communities. You know, our communities were really hit with smallpox at the start of colonization. 90% of communities being wiped out, but having very sophisticated methods of being able to communicate this threat of smallpox through song, dance, and language to be able to warn other community members other communities to go into the mountains and to wait it out. The Spanish flu 100 years ago had a devastating effect on our communities as well. So we have these teachings and these understandings that could prepare us for these challenges and this ongoing challenge of COVID-19. I'm wondering if there's any, Chrissy, is there any questions that have come through, or perhaps you might have a question for Tanya. It's been such an engaging conversation. I've been really enjoying just hearing. I could just listen to you talk. I don't even have to say anything.
It has been amazing. Like I've been sitting here, and I feel very moved by the entire conversation today. It's been quite amazing. We have one question from the audience. Sally has asked, she says that, you know, unfortunately, we don't have a treaty here between First Nations people and the colonizers. And she asks about the importance of treaty and what that does to actually come to a treaty.
I appreciate that very, very much. I wish I could say that treaties were treated fairly, but they have not been. You know, I think it was U.S. General Tecumseh Sherman who said, "I've signed 1,000 treaties with, you know, Indigenous people, and I haven't lived up to one of them." That's very true. Same in Canada, where the treaties were organized by the Crown, you know, members of the provincial government here in Ontario for Treaty Number 9, Government of Canada representatives. Imagine that, though. So you've got all of these British people here speaking with their own language and their own sense of the law and what a legal document is, speaking to a group of First Nations people that don't speak the language, don't write or read, and are basically getting the treaties interpreted to them by members of the church, you know, or so everyone had their own interests, right? But the treaties were supposed to be nation to nation agreements, an agreement between nations. So my nation made an agreement with the Government of Canada and the Crown, for instance, under the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, which predates the founding of Canada. Has that treaty been lived up to? No. All across Canada, you will see that same thing. You know, like treaty payments, for example. There was written in the treaty that you're supposed to get, I think it's around $4 a year as a signature of the treaty, you know, and your family members will also get that $4 a year. And part of the treaty is, you know, as we grow and as the country grows and as we benefit from the resources and the riches of the land, we will share equally the profits. Guess what? My family still gets $4 a year. You know, like, yeah, there was no equalization. And so now we have the situation of the courts coming in, and imagine how much that's going to cost, right? But it's the law, but it was never respected. And we see that time and time again all across the country. Yeah. So the Canadian government actually spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year in court fighting against the treaties that they sign.
Oh. Look, I sort of have a question here too, in that, you know, just hearing the two of you speak together, and also when I read books by Indigenous peoples from various different communities around the world, I see those parallels so strongly. It's almost like, you know, they echo each other in terms of the issues that everyone's dealing with, and also the way people deal with it within their community. And I wonder whether there is a power and an extra strength from Indigenous peoples from different countries connecting and talking and that kind of exchange. And I'm wondering what that kind of exchange is looking like at the moment, and if that is actually a power that that your various peoples take from speaking with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I hope so. You know, there was when I went to northern Norway and to Stockholm. I was there with something called the Federata Group, which is a group of mental health professionals, all Indigenous from colonized nations. And so that is where I met Helen Milroy, Dr. Helen Milroy, you know, the very first First Nations psychiatrist. That's a woman, you know, and she was the one that really held my hand and told me everything about what was happening in Australia. There were some other officials there from Australia as well, and there were some Maori people that were that ran youth centers. They were there too. We had people from the Sami lands. We had people from America with us, from Canada, all Indigenous. And there was definitely a power with all of us getting together. You could feel it, you know, and the commonality of experience was something.
That's fantastic. Look, I really, I highly recommend that people grab a copy of your book, and also alongside of that, that they read some of the books by Indigenous people in Australia as well. I know a lot of people are certainly in our bestseller list for the past month. We've had book after book by Aboriginal Australians in our bestseller list at Avid, and I feel so excited to see this happening and continuing to happen. I thought maybe it was a part of the marches that we had, but now I see that week after week, the bestseller list is topped by, you know, Ellen's book, Melissa's book, you know, lots of other Aboriginal Australians' books, and I feel good about that. It makes me feel good to see.
It's just because we're the best writers, Chrissy.
It's true. That is absolutely true. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Tanya, this never happened before, but 2 years in a row, we've had a First Nations female writer win our richest literary prize, the Miles Franklin Award for a novel. So that just happened last week. Tara June Widge won the award with a novel called The Yield, which is a kind of a bilingual work, which is written in Wiradjuri, the language of central New South Wales, and English. So I know, Chrissy, I went into Avid the other day and I could not get a copy. It's hopefully, have you got a new print run coming? A new run coming into the shop?
Yeah, it was like we already had sold so many of that book before it won, and then as soon as it won, there was a massive rush. It was like, who hasn't read it? Like it felt like everyone must have read it by the amount we'd sold. But you know, we do have another print run coming, and it's amazing that that, you know, that these books are the most popular books for our bookshop, and I'm heartened by it. I think that it's a big shift, and it's also because these writers are the most amazing writers in Australia. That's true, but also that they're being read by non-Indigenous people is a really wonderful thing as well.
Yeah,
so
and just to backtrack, I just want to backtrack on your question, Chrissy, about the strength of us First Nations peoples in communication across the world, and just really wanted to acknowledge that just my own work as a writer would not be possible without the vast reading that I did, you know, not just looking at First Nations writing in Australia, but in in Turtle Island and in the Pacific and in India and in other countries, and all of these writers that I read their work and was inspired by their work and felt hopeful to be able to write in my own voice and to write fiction that imagined better lives for us as peoples. And so I'm really in depth, you know, and really enamored by all of these writers, and I always whenever I'm writing nonfiction or whenever I'm constructing or curating something, I always put First Nations writers you know, at the center. I quote from our neighbors from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I quote from Turtle Island. You know, I see us as you know, this literature of resistance being so important to the future of our communities.
Absolutely.
Well said. Well said. Yeah.
This has been one of the most powerful events that we have run, not just over Zoom, but at AVID in general. I feel incredibly honoured to be hosting this event. The two of you have been an incredible inspiration to me, and I'm sure that our audience today and in the future will feel that when they see this and hear your words. I'd like to thank both of you very, very much for joining us, and I'm also hoping to open the floor so that people can unmute themselves to clap. But if you had any final words before we go, that's a very good point, Ellen. This is the book. This is the book. And Tanya, thank you so much for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Miigwech to you, Ellen, and to you, Chrissy. I've really enjoyed this this hour, and it's the second best thing to being there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to allow participants to unmute themselves so we can just clap. So thank you, everybody, and let's have a clap.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Chrissy.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I hope to see you
Thank
again
you.
someday.
Okay, see you later, everyone. Bye.